In the dead of the night, an albino Burmese python slips out of its tank and slithers across the floor. Starved for more than a month, the 8-foot predator is on the hunt for food. It noses open 2-year-old Shaianna's bedroom door and climbs the side of her crib. The toddler peacefully sleeps when suddenly the python wraps itself around her neck and holds her firmly in its jaws. Hit like and subscribe. This is Fierce. Gypsy was an 8-foot 6-inch Burmese python, but she was more than that. She was the beloved pet of 21-year-old Shaianna Hare, who had bought her at a flea market for $200 when she was just 14. The snake was docile and lovable. She often traveled with Shaianna on the front seat of the car when she went out. Some people take their dogs and cats along for the ride. Shaianna took her pet python, but Shaianna was unemployed and she no longer had the finances to pay for the snake. Plus, she now had an extra mouth to feed. Her 2-year-old daughter, Shaianna, was growing quickly. She was a happy, bubbly toddler, and the two of them shared their house with Shaianna's boyfriend, 34-year-old Charles Darnell. Friends and family offered to care for the snake until Shaianna could afford to feed it, but Shaianna declined the offers. They even offered to buy proper living conditions for the snake. Shaianna's mother could see that the snake was a dangerous pet. She had warned her about keeping the snake in the same house as her young granddaughter, but Shaianna insisted that the snake had never caused any trouble before. Gypsy the python lived in a tank, but there was no lid. Having been starved for more than a month, she was desperate to find some food. Her natural instincts to hunt for prey took over, and she wriggled out of her tank. Sometimes she escaped in the night, and Shaianna and Charles would wake up to find her tank empty, and they would have to search the house for her. She was severely malnourished. At more than 8 feet long, she should have weighed around 150 pounds, or 70 kilograms, but poor Gypsy only weighed 13 pounds, 6 kilograms. Her last meal was a squirrel that Shaianna and Charles had found dead on the road a month before. This was no way to treat an animal, and Shaianna's claims that Gypsy was her beloved pet weren't reflected in the care she provided for her. In the wild, Burmese pythons eat a meal every 2 weeks. These would typically be larger than the squirrel provided for her by Shaianna and Charles. Pythons are perfectly capable of eating prey that is 5 times as wide as their own heads. They have particularly stretchy ligaments in their jaws, which allows them to expand their mouths around large animals, consuming them whole. On July 1, 2009, 2-year-old Shaianna was put down to sleep in her cot. That night, Gypsy escaped from her cage once more. She lifted her head up off her tank floor, and she nosed the duvet that was lying overhead. She pushed her way under it. She had learned how to do this many times before. In the past 4 weeks alone, she had slithered out of her tank at least 5 times. Neither Shaianna or Charles saw this as a threat. No alarm bells were ringing, despite being in charge of a small 2-year-old. This time when Gypsy slithered out, she was determined to succeed. She went undetected as she made her way along the floor. Her movements were silent and stealthy. The house was quiet and still. Her long body was painfully thin, and her small beady eyes dull and withdrawn. The snake could smell Shaianna as it flicked its tongue in and out of its mouth. It pushed its way into the toddler's bedroom undetected, and it raised its head up along the side of the cot. The albino python climbed the side of the cot, pulling all 8 feet of its body off the floor. It curled around the top of the crib and slipped over the top. It could sense the warmth from the toddler's body and the tiny vibrations from her breathing. The snake crawled into Shaianna's bed and quickly wrapped itself around her neck. The toddler squirmed when she felt the pressure, but there would have been nothing she could do. She was tiny in comparison to the enormous snake, and Burmese pythons can constrict by exerting a pressure of 6 psi. In the wild, although they typically prey on birds and small mammals, they can tackle and eat alligators and feral pigs. They are immensely strong and secure their prey with a sharp bite before rapidly wrapping their coils around its body. As the prey animal exhales, the snake squeezes tighter, preventing the animal from taking in another breath, and so the prey suffocates or dies from cardiac arrest. Gypsy squeezed tightly around Shaianna's neck. Her blood pressure built up. She was starved of oxygen, and she was dead within a matter of seconds. The snake bit down on the young girl's head and began trying to consume her, expanding its jaws to envelop the toddler's head, inching her fangs over her prey, pulling it into her mouth. That's how Charles found them. When he went to check on Shaianna, he found the snake coiled tightly around her, its fangs latched onto her head. Shaianna's face was blue and she wasn't moving. Her eyes were shut. He desperately tugged to get the snake off, but it wouldn't budge. He raced to the kitchen and grabbed a knife. Running back into Shaianna's room, he stabbed the snake until it eventually released the girl and recoiled in the corner of the crib. But it was too late for Shaianna. She had been starved of oxygen for too long, and Charles couldn't bring her back. Jaren raced into the room and held her baby in her arms. Charles made a distressing call to 911. She got out of the cage last night and got into the baby's crib and strangled her to death. I'm going to kill her. And that's what he did. He stabbed the snake again out of anger and desperation, and the pet that Jaren had owned for years succumbed to the attack. The deeply traumatizing incident didn't end there. When police arrived at the scene, they arrested both Jaren and Charles. They had failed to look after Shaianna and had failed to look after the pet snake. It was a disaster waiting to happen, and when they attended court, the jury found them both guilty of child neglect and manslaughter. The couple was sentenced to 12 years each in prison. They lost everything, but Shaianna lost her life. Shaianna's biological father, Joseph Gilkerson, was furious. There had been concerns raised about the care of his daughter before, and he didn't understand why no measures had been put in place to ensure her safety. The Florida Department of Children had visited the home before when questions were raised about the child's care, and they would have seen the python being kept there. It is common practice for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission to inspect properties with captive pythons in them to ensure they are adequately and safely secured in their tanks. No wildlife officials were informed of the python, and so no such investigation was carried out. If it had been, then it would likely have saved an innocent young girl's life. Because of this, Joseph sued the Florida Department of Children for wrongful death. He was seeking in excess of $15,000 for mental anguish. Jaren and Charles were both released from prison in September 2021, having served their time. They were both placed on supervised probation until 2026 and declined to comment to the press, except for mentioning that the two of them were planning on getting married.